I'm happy to ask them. Is that the first one was just who would you say is actually driving the whole thing? That is, who are the people who are we up against? Is it the LEPs, or is it the colleges, or is there a way of breaking down the various people who need to be influenced or opposed or embarrassed, and that one could sort of work out a strategy of who we're against?
You have to start at the top, Michael. It's one of Boris Johnson's favourite schemes with the Chancellor. It goes to the ultimate responsibilities in number 10 and 11 Downing Street. Chris Krasnowski is very clear about that. And then, of course, they're calling together a cross-ministerial group this summer. It's going to be called the ARC Growth Body, I think, that will push these proposals forward. And then, of course, each ministry will be responsible for developing its bit of it, and through them and the local authorities to the local enterprise partnerships, deciding what happens within each different part of the ARC. So it's all the way from 10 Downing Street to your local district council.
And shall I carry on to Megan next? Megan has a question.
Thanks. I'm happy to sort of park mine if it's mine may be less important than perhaps some of the others. Mine was only going to be basically more about the railway project and whether that is perceived as a potentially beneficial kind of infrastructure project if it could be separated from the rest of all of this.
Shall I have a quick word about that? Because the East-West Rail is in fact very interesting. Of course, it's following the old track of the Barnsley Rail all the way to Bedfordshire, because that was never sold off, which is good. From Bedford to Cambridge, it's turning out to be quite controversial because they want to take it from Bedford to the new South Cambridge station. The old Barnsley line went from Bedford to North Cambridge. So to go to South Cambridge, you've got to cut across green countryside, and the people in the villages there are getting very worried. Obviously, public transport is much better than private transport in principle. East-West Rail originally was going to be totally electrified. It won't be. They're not putting in the gantries, so it will have diesel trains. It was going to carry a lot of freight, for which you need freight loops because it's both passenger and freight. And for passenger trains to overtake freight, you've got to have loops to park the freight trains in. They won't build as many freight loops as they originally planned to, so it's being downscaled. And finally, there were going to be links to Aylesbury, to East-West Rail. In fact, a very small link from Milton Keynes down to East-West Rail, at Bletchley probably. Both of those small links have also recently been cancelled. So East-West Rail is essentially been emasculated to the minimum line from Oxford to Cambridge, which should be open by about 2030. And the plan is probably going to be that along East-West Rail there will be certain stations, and developers will look to put high-density houses around East-West Rail stations. That's the general idea. Ideal, of course, you should be able to walk or cycle to a station, then you could go to work on the train to Oxford, Cambridge or Milton Keynes. As I say, this is a development, it will affect some people. It can't fail to. But it's better than an expressway, which is car-dependent sprawl.
Great. The next question is from Ines. Are you happy to ask that, Ines?
Please carry on.
Go ahead, James. You can just read it out.
Okay. Ines is asking, how much has been formally agreed and by whom?
Very good question. If you live in Oxfordshire, you're aware of the Oxfordshire Growth Deal. That's a deal for 215 million to deliver 100,000 houses in current local plans, which are causing all the fuss and distress in South Oxford District Council charges, in fact, all the local councils. That Oxfordshire Growth Deal is part of OxCam Arc plans, because as part of that growth deal, the government gave Oxfordshire 2 or 3 million to develop the Oxfordshire 2050 spatial plan, which is the local plan beyond the mid-2030s. That 2050 spatial plan is obliged to assume the OxCam Arc as a given. And the government is talking about growth deals for all the counties across the Arc. Oxfordshire is sort of test bed for the growth deal. And I noticed that we've got Sue on the line here, who might like to tell us, Sue of Bioabundance and South Oxford District Councillor, who might like to tell us what the result of an overinflated housing target, which is what the Oxfordshire Growth Deal involves, what the result is for one of the local councils. Sue, do you want to say anything?
That's pretty simple. We're building 4 times the number of homes that we can fill. So we're building 32,000 homes over a period that the Office for National Statistics says that we will create 8,000 new households. So necessarily, for every house that becomes a home, 3 newly empty houses are created, and they may be the that they may not be the houses that are being built. They might just be the Oxford mansions or the Chiltern villages. I wanted to ask you a question, though. You said this was a coalition of the willing.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Buckinghamshire have pulled out of it. We in South Oxfordshire haven't pulled out of it. We don't have very strong leadership, unfortunately. And I am told, when I say we should pull out of it, oh, well, Buckinghamshire may think they've pulled out of it, but they will still have everything imposed upon them. They just don't have a seat at the table. So don't you think that we should all just pull out of it? If all the councils pulled out of it, then it would be quite difficult for Whitehall to continue with this nonsense.
It would, Sue. As you say, Bucks pulled out, effectively Bucks pulled out the Arc Universities group. The government refused to let it leave the Arc spatial plan. It's a bit like Hotel California. You can check out, but you can't leave. It would be good if other local councils withdrew, but in case of Oxfordshire, of course, that Oxfordshire growth deal, which we're committed to, is part and parcel of the Oxford-Cambridge Arc. It's difficult to see how you can withdraw from an agreement when you've already signed up to it, or part of it, or the beginning of it.
Do you think it was there then, the growth deal?
No, if you read the growth deal details, it mentions the OxCam Arc. And certainly those 2 million to develop the Oxford Spatial Plan, that is very clear. It is to develop the spatial plan in the light of OxCam Arc development.
That was very concerning. The next question is from Joanna.
You need to unmute, Joanna.
Yeah, actually, mine follows on directly from that, because I don't really know, and I would like to know whether what the position of the different political parties is locally. I mean, I'm assuming, with the exception of I guess if the councils haven't pulled out, is it right to assume that the lead political group on all the councils is currently in favour of this, or there's a division within groups, or are there any parties that are opposing it?
Joanna, that's interesting. When the Expressway was in play, several local councils voted against Expressway, which is good. Mostly, I'm afraid, Tory councils are supportive of OxCam Arc plans. Of course, Oxford, the Labour council in the city, is also in favour of OxCam Arc development. It's really under the Lib Dems who've been consistently against the Expressway, and they're consistently against overdevelopment of excess housing numbers.
Okay.
You're aware that obviously the local elections happen tomorrow. Our campaign is targeting those councillors who previously supported the OxCam Arc plan, and there are 1 or 2 in our county who strongly support, including the then leader of the county council, strongly supported OxCam Arc plans. With a relatively narrow majority, there's a time tomorrow to overturn that particular party and candidate.
Right, thank you.
We've had a few people pointing out in the chats that the Greens are also supporting,
yes,
or opposing rather.
I do beg your pardon. Yes, of course, the Greens as well. The Greens as well. I want to stress that the No Expressway group is desperately trying to be apolitical. We would be against this scheme, whichever party suggests it. We're not anti-Tory, we're anti the scheme. That's really very important. If some parties consistently support us, then we'll support those parties, but we are not political.
I think there aren't. Oh, sorry. Someone just tried speaking.
Oh, that was me. I was going to say, my dad asked a question which I thought was really interesting, which I'd like to ask, which was, is it vulnerable to legal challenge on the grounds it's an irrational decision?
If only, Harriet, if only. Yes, there are so many irrational decisions being taken up now. Look at PPE contracts, for example. I think sometimes one feels one is run by a madhouse. You would have to, I mean, I think South Oxford District Council's experience shows that the law is applied to these various developments. And if there is an appeal, all that the inspector does is to say, has this plan fulfilled all the legal requirements? The inspector can't say, is this a stupid plan? The inspector only has to judge, is this a legal plan? And that's actually quite a narrow remit for an inspector. You might think it's a completely daft idea, but if it conforms to the NPPF and so on, then it's fine. And the trouble with the National Planning Policy Framework is, and also, by the way, with the new Environment Bill, is that there are key clauses throughout it which says that, effectively, well, if there's a disagreement of a local authority with the Secretary of State, the Secretary of State can simply call it in and decide. In the Environmental Bill, if there's no possibility of achieving net gain in certain places, the Secretary of State can call it in and decide there is no need to achieve net gain in particular circumstances. So there's always opt-out clauses even within the law. And you imagine that developers are going to exploit those opt-out clauses whenever it suits them. I think, I mean, there is a problem for developers. There's a triple whammy coming down the line for them, which is going to make all their projects much more expensive. The first is building regulations are going to insist that houses are built better. They're more insulated. The second one is there's got to be net environmental gain of all their properties. And the third one is that the buildings have got to be more beautiful. The Building Better, Building Beautiful Commission has produced a series of what are called design codes, which you might call pattern books, which all new housing has got to conform to. It defines things like the shapes and sizes of windows in new buildings. Now, whether or not you agree with it, all of these three things will increase the cost of building houses. And you know how developers at the moment manage to wriggle out of affordability clauses on the grounds that if they build affordable houses, the whole project becomes unviable economically. They're going to use exactly the same unviability argument to say, well, I can't provide net gain, I can't produce beautiful houses, I can't produce zero carbon houses because it makes my whole project unprofitable. There's a huge problem coming down the line with all this new legislation, I'm afraid.
I have one last.
Yeah. Please.
I just have one last thought. I think it's really great that you've given this talk to XR, and I don't know how XR Oxford. I don't know how many other talks you've given to XR, but I was wondering if maybe there'd be a way. If I just feel like it'd be good if you were to give more talks to XR, kind of across the region, if that was possible, just to get them all.
Happily. I think the one thing that we do need to do as a group of concerned people is that democratic deficit is deeply, deeply worrying. And our campaign before COVID shows us that when we went to villages, we gave talks in village communities, for example, they were horrified to see the scale of development proposed, and they really didn't want it to happen. They didn't know about it. When they heard about it, they were horrified. So when you alert local communities, they can become very active and very concerned. I think what needs to happen across the Arc is a series of very carefully arranged citizens' assemblies to get people's feelings about how they want their area to develop. The government always says it will communicate with the local communities to make sure there's a sense of place in all the new developments across the Arc. That's not going to happen. But if we can get the local communities saying to government with one voice, this is how we want our Arc to develop, the government at least has to listen, surely. And at the moment, it's not listening.
Michael has his hand up next.
Oh, I was just going to say, is it was two questions. One was, is the whole thing vulnerable to the fact that you'd think that every other bit of England would probably want would want a share of this development? That the fact that we're getting so much more than we need means that other areas must be getting much less than they need. And is there a way of kind of extracting pressure from that to put on the government or on the government departments? So,
Yes.
And also just generally, what would you recommend as the kind of tactics for opposing it?
The OxCam Arc was suggested, Michael, because the government pointed out that the OxCam Arc is already quite productive. It contributes to the national wealth, national income. And so the idea is that it should be boosted even more. You know, you're doing well, boost even more. And in a sense, if you boost the Treasury more, then the Treasury can then dish out funds to the less advantaged parts of the country. Now, what that will do, of course, is increase the inequality across the region. If you boost a successful region and leave the others behind, you boost inequality. And England is the most unequal country in Europe. It's got the richest city, London. It's got 4 or 5 of the poorest regions in Europe. It's a disgrace, the inequality of the UK at the moment. There are other groups, of course. There's a Midlands group of MPs looking to develop the Midlands. And by the way, Centre for Cities report showed that if we invest in the Midlands and the North, the increased economic output wouldn't be the 163 billion of all the hoo-ha of the ARC, it would be 183 billion. We could get greater economic output without building 1 million homes. And the question about the 1 million homes is, where will the workers come from? We've got full employment in the OxCam Arc area. Build 1 million new homes. You have to suck workers from the north, where houses are relatively cheap, to a place where houses are impossibly expensive, and building more houses won't change that. Again, the better idea is to put the jobs up north. And of course, recently, Jake Berry MP produced a document called A Northern Big Bang, making the case for the boosting the northern, basically George Osborne's northern engine. I'm slightly worried about Berry's document because it simply asks the government to produce a few enabling legislations, and then basically it expects a tsunami of investment into the north. It wants all the regulations removed, and it wants the north to become the new industrial revolution heartland, as it was a century and a half ago, but for the new green industries. So there are other areas of the country that are calling out for growth, certainly, and I think even the ARC proponents say 2021 is a critical year for the ARC. So you've cancelled the expressway. We've just had COVID. It's time to reassess the economic benefits of the ARC, which I hope I showed are pretty negligible. And it would make more sense to invest what we've got in the other areas of the country to bring them up to the same sort of level as in the south. I mean, 50% of the R&D in this country is spent in the south. No wonder it's productive. Spend 50, more than all the money in the south, you get all the productivity gains in the south.
Megan has a question next in the chat.
Megan.
Oh, go back to remember what my question was. Oh, well, yes, this was really just following up partly from what you've said and partly directly in response to Harriet. I was wondering about whether you see a very specific role for XR style tactics. So you kind of suggested we sort of need to do everything we can. Obviously, there are the usual political mechanisms, and there's lots of talk about how to vote in the chat. But of course, XR's usual role is to do something more disruptive and forms of direct action, a little like that we've seen with HS2. So I just wondered whether you had, I mean, hopefully the fact that you're here to talk to us implies that you think there is something that XR could do on this front that maybe is kind of XR's particular role. So do you think that there is room for direct action alongside the normal putting pressure on?
We would like to talk to you, definitely. I mean, there are certainly things that you could help with, like those citizens' assembly meetings, I think would be extremely useful for all of us, would help you, and it would certainly help us. In terms of direct action, in a sense, you're at the moment tilting at a windmill. The windmill isn't there yet. They haven't started digging. So I'm not quite sure about that, but I think if we combined together and said, just what a stupid idea this was, we might even manage to stop it. I think your problem with HS2 is it was far too advanced as a plan, as an approved plan, before perhaps you got into action on that. But yes, we would like, as a group, we would like to talk to you. There's a lot of common interest.
I actually have a question for myself. Sorry, Branda's just put her hand up. Would you like to ask a question, Branda?
David, is there any chance that the developers will do it for us? To the extent, as you were saying, only 1 in 4 is going to be occupied. Are they really going to want to build so many?
Well, look, Brenda, we all know the answer to that, that houses are an investment vehicle for so many people, second homes, overseas people, Chinese people buy up whole blocks of flats. They're not interested in renting them out. They're interested in the increase in land values. I mean, the investors have bought whole streets in London that haven't been rented out. They're just waiting for the value of the land to go up. It's a disgrace what we've done to our housing stock and the land on which it sits. I mean, the statistic that absolutely terrifies me, in the 1930s, when you bought a house, 2% of what you paid for the house was for the land on which the house sits. Today, it's 70%. 70% of the price that young people pay for the house is actually for the land on which the house sits. That's why houses are so expensive. The other statistic, Brenda, you're probably aware of, is that local authorities since the Thatcher era have sold off publicly owned land. They've sold off publicly owned land equal to 10% of the entire land area of the UK, worth, according to Brett Christopher's, £400 billion. They're doing it, of course, to make ends meet in the austerity. They've been recently told by Robert Jenrick to produce yet another list of publicly owned land they still own in order for a fire sale, I imagine. But publicly owned land is free. If we were building social houses on public owned land, we could drastically reduce the price of houses. We could build much better quality houses easily, as they did in Goldsmith Street. I can wax lyrical about Goldsmith Street forever. It's 100 passive house, better than zero carbon houses. It's social housing, 100 square meters per house, perfectly insulated, lots of light in each property, 100,000 per dwelling. That's what it costs on land owned by Norwich Council. And of course, Coin Street in London is a wonderful example of how a community can build itself. Please do look up the Coin Street brochure on the web. It gives you some faith in human beings, but it's both of those things were effectively produced outside the private property developer market. We need to do much, much more of that.
Okay. Thank you.
I had one last thing.
Hattie.
I was going to say, if people are interested and they want to kind of stay a bit more up to date, I could send an email around kind of with our various social medias and a link to our website where you can find out more information and subscribe to the mailing list if you want to stay interested. Would people be interested in such an email? Or yeah, I mean, I just need email addresses basically, and I can send.
Thumbs up from your father, Hattie.
I saw that, yeah. I don't know, I just thought that might be a good way for people to stay in the know.
Please do. I mean, we need all the publicity we can get.
On that front then, just as we're sort of bringing things to a close, and thank you so much, David, I sort of feel like there's been one question further up and I feel like there'll be more about the accessibility of these materials. So for example, I think Michael asked about whether there's a record of your slides and what we might do with the recording and how that might be accessible to people. And I don't have a plan for that, I'll be freely admit. And I don't know, of course, everyone who's here tonight. I don't have contact details for everyone who's here tonight. So I wondered what your thoughts were on the best way of sharing some of this information.
Well, we shamelessly keep everything we do, Megan, so it's on our website. So I've given a couple of talks recently via Zoom and so on, and they're on the No Expressway Group website. They're under the events page, lots of news under the events page. And there are YouTube recordings of a tour I gave recently. And this one will also be on there eventually. And perhaps separately, I can make the slides available as well if the quality wasn't so good on the screen.
That's great.
Happy to do that. Happy to do that.
I think that's very clear, and it'd be brilliant if people can just go back and get access to the talk to share with others.
Can I just ask a quick question? I think we're probably coming to the end, but has this already gone through Parliament, David? Has there been parliamentary approval? And what's the discussion been like? Are there MPs on, across the parties who are opposed to this that we could kind of engage with?
No, it hasn't. In a sense, it's not that sort of plan. It's sort of piecemeal at the moment. I guess certain chunks of legislation will have to go through Parliament. For example, if you're going to build 1 million new houses or anything like 1 million new houses, you probably can't put them in existing settlements. You've got to develop new towns. In the budget of last year, the government earmarked 4 new towns west of Cambridge, possibly along the line of East West Rail. And new towns do require legislation, including, with luck, capturing land value, but that's a bit of a hot chestnut. But in terms of, is there one proposal or one bit of legislation for the whole ARC scheme, the answer is no. The government would say, of course, it's still premature. 2 documents that came out in February, the ARC spatial framework has a timetable which suggests it'll take 2 more years to produce details of what the government thinks the spatial arrangement across the ARC will be. And England's Economic Heartland produced a document on transport links across the ARC, which is fairly mature. It assumes a certain level of development. But certainly the ARC spatial plan has got 2 more years in the making. What happens to it after that, I'm really not quite sure, because there are so many different facets here. You see, it really will concern most ministries, the ones I mentioned about the minister not seeing, that's housing, transport, business, international trade. We're told by a representative of PricewaterhouseCoopers, overseas investors are queuing up to pour money into the OxCam Arc. DEFRA in the environment ministries as well.
Well, thank you so much, David.
Pleasure.
That was incredibly informative. I'm sure, like me, everyone else has now got their head absolutely buzzing with all these facts, figures, thoughts and anxieties as well. And it's great to see there are over 50 people here tonight, and I'm sure that there'll be an awful lot of spreading the word among those different communities that those people represent. And I'm sure you're going to get more requests as well for talks. Is it easy enough to contact you through the website?
Yes, go to the website and then you can send me an email.
Wonderful. I'm sure you'll get more requests.
If you've got a pen and pen, it's the noexpresswaygroup@gmail.com, but it's also on the website.
Okay, wonderful, thank you. And yeah, just thank you. That was incredibly informative, incredibly detailed, and really, really eye-opening and high value. I can see a lot of hand waving going on.
Yes, thank you.
Among the XR crowd, which is definitely a very affirmative response.
Yeah, thank you all for coming.